There was a time, not so long ago, when things didn't move so fast, when the battlefield stretched across people's computers, and when shooting faster just wasn't enough. It wasn't all about reflexes. You had to think, plan, build, and adapt to every situation. These were times when, perhaps due to technical limitations, intelligence prevailed over brute force, or rather, brute skill. Games with astonishing depth that didn't need crazy graphics to work as a product. It was the golden age of the RTS genre in real-time strategy games. Games that put us in the shoes of commanders, emperors, generals, and visionary or genocidal leaders, depending on which vibe you prefer. Games where every click was a decision that could change the course of the match, and where every second lost brought you a little closer to defeat. If you've played StarCraft 2, you know what I mean. During the 90s and early 2000s, mastering an RTS was a true art, only comparable to mastering a character in a mainstream fighting game like Tekken or Street Fighter. Classics like Warcraft, Age of Empires, Command & Conquer, or even StarCraft itself not only sold millions and millions of copies, but also defined an entire generation of gamers, among whom I include myself, because Age of Empires 2 was my childhood game. But as the years went by little, the roar of tanks and catapults began to fade away. The villages stopped gathering wood and bases are no longer being built. What happened to the RTS genre? How did such an influential style of game end up becoming a niche thing? Almost a rarity? In this video, we're going to explore the meteoric rise of this legendary genre and its slow but inevitable fall, as well as its recent and potential resurrection. We will analyze its origins, its impact on the industry, the mistakes that led to its decline, and why I still hold out hope. This is the rise and fall of the RTS genre. The real-time strategy genre wasn't born overnight. Its seed was planted in the 1980s, in an era when video games were still in their infancy, defining their own rules with every new title that came out. One of the first games that could be considered a strategy game with a more or less similar structure, although a bit rudimentary, was Herzog 2, released in 1989 for the Sega Genesis. Despite its German name, it was a Japanese game that mixed action with real-time unit management, a rarity for its time, but a pioneer almost without realizing it. However, the true explosion of the genre came in 1992, when Westwood Studios' Dune 2 defined what could be considered the structure, the mold of the modern RTS. In this game, we already had the typical mechanics like gathering resources, building a base, producing units, and managing them to defeat the enemy. Everything happened in real time, with no turns and with direct control over what was happening on the battlefield. That framework, as simple as it was brilliant, became the foundation upon which the great giants of the genre that we all know would be built. In 1995, this same company, the developer Westwood, did it again with Command & Conquer, adding cinematic storytelling, live-action cutscenes, which have now become a hallmark of the saga, and a rather revolutionary interface, even though it looks a bit dated now. On the other hand, in 1994, Blizzard Entertainment released Warcraft, Orcs and Humans. This game laid the groundwork and created the world that would later serve as the foundation for the hugely popular World of Warcraft, and the subsequent Warcraft games, like Warcraft 2, which was released just the following year, in 1995. It was a strategy game that brought a vibrant fantasy world to the genre, full of personality and with a much more refined design. Because the truth is, the first Warcraft Orcs and Humans is a bit rough around the edges. But it wasn't until 1998 that Blizzard Entertainment really outdid themselves with StarCraft. 3 completely different races, balanced with incredible precision, and an epic science fiction story that attracted both casual and competitive players. StarCraft was absolute madness, a true cultural phenomenon, especially in South Korea. It wasn't just a game, it was a sport, with televised broadcasts, professional teams, and players who became true celebrities in that country. We're talking about the very first seed that gave rise to the whole esports phenomenon. That's no small feat. At Semple Studios, just a year earlier in 1997, they released Age of Empires, a historically themed RTS that was quite different from the science fiction settings the genre was used to in the 90s. It stood out for its setting, yes, but also for its slightly slower gameplay, which gave you more time to think. A formula that was defined and greatly improved for the sequel, Age of Empires 2, which was released in 1999 and would become one of the most beloved games in the genre to this day, combining accessibility with strategic depth and a medieval setting that, honestly, was pretty cool. I think this game doesn't really need much more discussion. I mean, it's still played today even more than Age of Empires 4 and, of course, more than Age of Empires 3. And that's even though it's now free. With these giants of the genre already on the market, we could say that the early 2000s were truly the golden age of RTS games. A ton of titles tried to stick to the formula, like Empire Earth, Battle Realms, Rise of Nations, Company of Heroes, even Warcraft 3, which set itself apart a bit by leaning more towards RPG elements, something that was really necessary to distinguish itself and move away from what StarCraft had become. The keys that made the genre successful are actually pretty easy to understand. The first thing is the feeling of total control. You weren't just a soldier or a hero, you were the mastermind behind everything. Every decision mattered. You were the true protagonist, and all the responsibility fell on you. On top of that, these games offered a level of strategic depth never seen before. I mean, economy, exploration, combat, adapting to the situation all at once. They were very demanding on an intellectual and cognitive level. Good players didn't just react, they anticipated. It was a natural evolution of chess adapted to video games, where competitive environments, tournaments, or LAN parties in a garage started to become popular, letting you face off against friends or strangers to see who was the smartest in the cave where you gathered to play. The prelude to esports. I mean, those garages must have smelled interesting. And back then, playing an RTS wasn't just playing, it could become a true social phenomenon. It was about living a war from above, building an empire from scratch, or leading a revolution with every click of the mouse. You didn't even need to get into competitive play to enjoy them. I myself, at 9 years old, had a blast building cities in Age of Empires against bots on super easy mode, just trying to defend myself from their crappy attacks. But like all good things, eventually it came to an end. By the late 2000s, something started to change. RTS games kept coming out, but they already felt a little different. Sales figures were no longer spectacular, servers were half empty, and public interest was starting to fade. There isn't a single factor that explains the decline of the genre. It's more like a perfect storm of changes in the industry and in the type of player. But basically, you could sum it up by saying that the new trends were much faster, more straightforward, and more accessible. Games like shooters or MOBAs started to take over the ground once held by RTS. Additionally, the popularity of consoles over PCs made developing these games much more complicated, since they were very difficult to adapt for play with a controller in front of a television. It was a very complex genre with a rather steep learning curve, which left out a growing number of casual players who preferred more direct action, like that offered by shooters, for example. In an industry that aims for mass sales, such a high learning curve posed a problem. On the other hand, new, more accessible and addictive genres, like fucking LOL for example, started drawing away a lot of RTS players. After all, MOBAs came from a mod of Warcraft 3, which is an RTS. And this makes sense because both genres share quite a few things, such as the need for strategic vision and adapting to changes during the match, but with certain advantages like clearer objectives, shorter matches, and a slightly lower learning curve. I'm not saying that playing LoL is easy, I'm just saying that it's easier to start playing LoL than to start playing damn StarCraft 2, which, by the way, was one of the last successful attempts to revive this genre. On the other hand, multiplayer shooters were lurking like Call of Duty, Battlefield, or even freaking Fortnite lately. They offered instant action, pure adrenaline, very short matches, you didn't really need to use your brain much, no economy or much complexity, perfect for playing on consoles. RTS didn't stand a chance in this market. That's why even the giants of the genre started to disappear. StarCraft 2 lost a lot of prominence in the last 5 years. There's barely any news about Command & Conquer. It was abandoned by EA and Age of Empires. Well, they tried with the fourth one. I enjoyed it quite a bit, but the truth is it didn't make as big of an impact as expected for a name like Age of Empires. Developing an RTS is relatively expensive and very risky, considering the current landscape where the average player's attention span isn't much greater than that of a hyperactive monkey. But then, why does it now feel like the genre is being revived just a few years after it was officially declared dead? After the near-total downfall of StarCraft 2 and the failure of Age of Empires 4? For me, the answer is pretty simple. And that's because consoles, PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo, are once again losing ground to the PC. Because let's be honest, the biggest obstacle RTS games faced in accessing the market and selling well was the PlayStation and Xbox controller. Because even though several things were tried, like Halo Wars, which was a strategy game perfectly designed to be played with a controller, or even some more experimental games that allowed you to command units by voice, these concepts never really caught on. Basically because no matter how hard you try, you'll never have the same level of control over all your units and your base with a controller. No, I don't even know what to call this thing. Besides, in the indie scene, we've seen a ton of awesome proposals like Dustfront, which I hope comes out soon, or Tempest Rising, which aims to revive the formula that Command & Conquer made popular. There are some really great ideas on the table, and if any of these titles achieve the success they deserve, we might see a revival of the genre, even if it's in a radically different way than before. A new situation for RTS games, where a bunch of smaller titles with a lot of personality sell well and are popular without the need for 3 or 4 big giants to dominate the market. Like what happened before with Warcraft, Age of Empires, StarCraft, and Command & Conquer. There are some of these games that I'm really looking forward to trying, and if you let me know in the comments which of the upcoming RTS games you want me to try, I'll give it a go. No problem. Happy to do it. And that's all for now. The video is getting a bit long. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I'm not going to add any rhymes because honestly, I just can't be bothered. So that's it. See you next time, my friend.